60 Great Ghost Stories, read by H. Washington Sawyer. Tonight's story, Sorworth Place, by Russell Kirk. But the age of chivalry is gone, the unbought grace of life, the cheap defense of nations, the nurse of manly sentiment and heroic enterprise is gone. It is gone, that sensibility of principle, that chastity of honor, which felt a stain like a wound, which inspired courage whilst it mitigated ferocity, which ennobled whatever it touched, and under which vice itself lost half the evil, by losing all its grossness. Edmund Burke, Reflections on the Revolution in France. In defiance of a faint ancient charm that perfumes its name, Sorworth today is a dirty and dreary little town, fouled by the colliery since its pit was sunk and a blot of hideous industrial workers' houses began to spread about it. The lanes are half derelict, now that the pit approaches exhaustion. At a turn of the High Street, or down close off the back Vennel, some fragments of old Scots masonry stand yet amidst a welter of hoardings and fish restaurants and corrugated iron roofing. To damp Sorworth, of all places, Mr. Ralph Bain, M.C., had contrived to drift at the end of a month of purposeless nights in family and commercial hotels or bare village taverns across 3 counties, drinks with strangers in one village, listless games of cards in the next town, inconsequential talks on buses or trains, dull glimpses of a pleasant wood there, an old church here. Thus February had run out, and the next little pension check would be forwarded to him at Sorworth, which spot he had chosen at random as his address for the first few days of March. Bain lounged by the door of the King's Arms in his old tweeds, with the cigarette burns neatly darned, and felt the crack in his skull more vexatious than usual, and shifted his long legs languidly. Sorworth had nothing to show him, but what place had. He lit a cigarette, though he already had smoked 3 more this morning than he once resolved to allow himself out of the indispensable pension check. At that moment a girl came out of a provision shop across the square, walking obliquely past the market cross in the direction of the King's Arms, and Bain, one hand cupped to shelter his match, his face inclined slightly downward, noticed the remarkable grace of her little feet. He glanced lazily up, then he threw away his match, let his cigarette go unlit, and instinctively straightened. He had not seen this lady before, but in that second it passed through his mind whimsically. Perhaps she's what drew me to Sorworth. Surely a man might travel a great way without meeting such a face as hers, pale, very pale, with lips a glowing natural red, and black hair, gathered with taste at the back of her head into a heavy roll that rested upon her firm shoulders. Her chin, too, was delicately firm. She carried herself with a dignity that seems to be dying in modern life, looking straight ahead, as if some reverie had walled her away from the grossness of Sorworth. Yet not, Bain judged from her mouth, a reverie wholly pleasant. Among the mill girls and the shop assistants and bedraggled housewives in Sorworth, there was none anything like her, and few anywhere else. As she passed by the King's Arms, she seemed to notice Bain. Their eyes met briefly. Then she lowered her lashes, unsmiling, and was gone up the Vennel. "Och, she's a bonny one, Mrs. Larlin." Happening to come to the door as the girl passed by, old MacLeod, who kept the King's Arms, had followed Bain's long look. "There will na be her like for aye, Mr. Bain, not at old Sorworth Place." MacLeod shook his head portentously. In his youth he had been a gardener at some house of Lord Bute's, and he continued to hold the country families in profound respect, muttering sourly about communists among the miners who drank at his bar. "She's young to have the care of a big house," said Bain, relapsed into lethargy and lighting his cigarette at last. "Aye, and we to be widowed, sir. Noo the hoose. She canna help to keep it in the old way, ye ken. Twa maids, and they carlins full of grinning, sir. Small comfort in a cold hoose that's nae sae canny. When all's said, it'll be rack and ruin forby, with half the grand houses in the county." And MacLeod proceeded to expatiate on his favourite topics, the decay of old families and the follies of socialism. "A widow?" put in Bain, lifting his heavy eyelids a bit. "She couldn't have been married a great while. What was this Lurlin like?" "Be what he was, sir. The gentleman's dead. Dead a year noo, Mr. Bain, and sma' gude clavering o' men in the grave." That said, MacLeod turned back to his pub, but Bain, surprised at this reticence in a publican who ordinarily manifested the full share of Scottish censoriousness, followed him. "He didn't die in the war?" inquired Bain. "Nay, nay," said MacLeod, thus brought to bay, and presently, "The drink, sir, the drink. That and mair. Dinna mistake me, Mr. Bain. The Lurlins were a braw old blood. Aye, but this Mr. Alistair Lurlin, he wasna o' the proper line, ye ken, nae mair than a cousin. And Mr. Hamish Lurlin, the old laird, died 7 years syne, and his twa sons were shot in Libya. First Alexander, then Hugh. Our 3 death duties maun to be paid, and the cousin comes to us left last year. This Mr. Alexander dies. Mair duties. Weel, Mrs. Lurlin keeps the house, and the policies, and a poor more besides. 90,000 acres Lurlin of Sorworth had before the First War. Noo, but a house was unca cold and clammy. Come away upstairs, sir, if ye be sae fascinated," this a trifle spitefully, "and ye can see the old place frae the attic, if ye have goot een." From the garret window of the King's Arms they looked over the pan tiles and corrugated iron roofs of the shabby town toward the serrated ridge some miles westward. On a flank of that hill, Bain could just make out the grey shape of a big ancient house, wraith-like against the heather and gorse and bracken. "There'll be nane older in the county," said MacLeod. Bain went down alone to the parlour, sat some minutes before the doddering fire, then addressed a note to Mrs. Lurlin, Sorworth Place. He was, he wrote truthfully enough, rather a dilettante in architecture. Recently he had heard her house spoken of as remarkable. He would be glad to see it, if no inconvenience would be caused, and he would be at Sorworth the rest of the week. After some hesitation, he signed himself M.C. The military cross, after all, was one of his few remaining links with decent society, and he had the right to use it. This letter posted, he went up to his room, brushed his old tweed suit, glanced at himself in the mirror, the heavy eyes, the long and regular features weakened by lines of indecision, the defiant half-grin of bravado. He grimaced, and the suture in the back of his head, a memento of the shell fragment that had given him his pension, winced in sympathy. To escape from self-dislike, he went down to the bar, very like fleeing from the cell to the jail yard. Late the next afternoon, an answer to his note came, written in a small round hand, which said that Mr. Bain would be shown about Sorworth Place if he would call on Thursday afternoon, and it was signed Anne Lurlin. The firm signature put Bain in mind of Mrs. Lurlin's elegant pale look, and he spent most of the intervening evening and night and morning in a reverie of nearly forgotten faces, men he had alienated by his negligence or improvidence, women he had found hollow or who had found him exasperating. None of these ever thought of him now, even when dreaming before the fire. Why should they? Shortly past noon on Thursday, he walked along an empty road toward a ridge called Sorworth Law. The road became a lane between two high and crumbling stone dikes, and then he was at the entrance to a neglected park on the side of a hill, its gates vanished, its gate lodge empty, all its larger trees felled by some timber merchant and the stumps left among the heaps of dead leaves. Bain turned up the drive, and soon he could see, on the bare slope above, the massive stone shape of the Place of Sorworth. Two square towers at either end, and between them, extending also far to the rear, an immense block of building, in part ashlar, but mostly rubble. None of this, except a fine large window above the entrance, was later than the 17th century, and most of it was far older. An intricacy of crow-stepped gables, turrets, dormers, and chimneys confused one's eyes when they roved upwards. All in all, the place was an admirable example of the Scots mansion house, unprettified by Balmorialism. A flight of heavy stone steps led up to the door, and on either side of the entrance projected a conical-capped turret, each supported at its base by an enormous corbel, curiously beveled. Some rods to the north could be made out to be what was left of a detached building, the roof of it gone. A chapel, perhaps. So far as Bain could see, there were only two entrances, the grand portal, and a small heavy door with wrought iron grill before it, that probably gave upon the kitchen. At the angles of either tower, musket holes or arrow loops, some blocked with mortar, the rest now closed with small panes of glass, flanked the entrance. The roofs were of ancient stone slabs. Away at the back, the stout dikes of a walled garden closed the view, although Bain could hear the rushing of a burn somewhere in that direction. The lawn before the place was unkempt, no better than pastures, and there, in one of the towers, and even in the main block, a broken pane glinted in the afternoon sun, and all about the strong gray house hung a suggestion of neglect and impoverishment that would have been more clearly manifest, doubtless, had not the mansion been so severe and rugged in its very character. The huge window of what must be the great hall broke the solidity of the facade just above the main door. Between this window and the doorway below, Bain perceived, as he climbed the steps, a terribly weathered coat of arms executed in a soft red sandstone. Appended to it some pious inscription in venerable barbarous Scots-Latin characters, most of them indecipherable. He could read only two words which composed the last lines. Larva resurgat. Larva resurgat? Why larva rather than spiritus? The old lairds sometimes put things quaintly. He found no bell, and so banged at the oaken door with a rusty knocker. After an interval of leaden silence, the door was pulled ajar a bit, and a sour woman's face peeked around it. Bain asked to be announced. The fat maid let him into a little round room with naked stone walls at the stair-foot, and locked the door again, and then conducted him up the twisting stone stair in one of the entrance turrets, its treads scooped hollow by centuries of feet, to a gigantic vaulted chamber, well lighted. The hall. It was fitted with 16th century paneling, painted with heraldic symbols and family crests. The air was cold, the yawning medieval fireplace quite empty. Here and there a Jacobean carved cupboard, or the polished surface of a table, or the tapestried chair endeavored to apologize for the emptiness of the place. None of the furniture seemed in good repair. Bain sat gingerly on a Chippendale piece, while the maid scurried off to some hidey-hole in this labyrinth of a house. After 3 to 4 minutes, Mrs. Larlin came down to him, emerging from behind a door concealed by a hanging. A faint smile hovered on her fine lips. Her eyes met his composedly, and Bain thought her most beautiful in an antique fashion. "I'll show you the curiosities of this draughty place, Mr. Bain," she said, in a low voice with an agreeable suggestion of West Coast accent about it. "If you'll pledge yourself to ignore the dust and damp. I have nothing left but the house and the policies and a bit of moor, you know, not even a home farm." Bain hardly knew what he said in reply, for she unsettled him, as if he had been shaken awake. Then Mrs. Larlin led him up the disused stairs and down into vaulted cellars and through chambers with mouldering tapestries, and Lord knows where else. Almost all these interminable rooms were empty. "Most was gone before the place became mine," said Mrs. Larlin, without visible embarrassment. "But I had to sell what was left of the furniture, except for a few sticks in really necessary rooms. I suppose the wreckers will buy the house when I'm dead. You can sell an 18th century house, just possibly in spite of rates, but not a behemoth like this. I can't afford to live here, but I can't afford to go away either." "Do you have some great barn of this sort, Mr. Bain?" "I haven't even a cottage," Bain told her, "or a stick of furniture." He thought her black eyes remarkably candid. She took him up to the summit of one of the towers, where they stood in the wind and looked over the braes that parallel the den of Sorworth water as it twists down to the sharp-toothed long skerries where it meets the sea. From this height they could see quite clearly the surf on the rocks, and some distance south, smoke from the fishing village of Sorworth Ness. Sorworth water was in spate, just at the tower's foot. The den veered straight up to the castle, so that a stone which Bain tossed over the rampart bounced down a steep slope and into the roaring burn. In the rough old days, the lairds of Sorworth had the security of a strongly situated house. "You're not afraid of heights, Mr. Bain?" asked this young woman. "No," he said. "I've climbed a good deal." "I fancy you're afraid of very little," she observed, lifting her eyebrows slightly. "Do you know that I happened to see you in the square 2 days ago? I thought you looked like a soldier. What were you?" He had been a captain, he told her. "Come down into the policies, Captain Bain," she said. As they descended, he bumped his head against the window ledge and cried out involuntarily. She stopped with an exclamation of sympathy. "A mortar crack in my skull," Bain apologized, "and I'm still tender. Probably always will be." "Does it pain you much, Captain Bain?" "No, but perhaps I ought to tell you that it makes me a trifle odd now and then, or so people seem to think." He did not mind confiding this to her. Perhaps it was the oddity that he had just acknowledged, but at the moment the two seemed to him the only realities in an infinity of shadows. "So much the better," she said, still lower. "Either that or something of the sort." "I beg your pardon, Miss Larlin?" "I mean this, Captain Bain. We seem to be birds of a feather. People hereabouts think that I am rather odd. Sorworth Place is soaked in oddity. The maids won't stay. I've only one now. The other went last week. Even Margaret, who's left, won't sleep in. She goes down to her son's cottage. I don't suppose you know why Janet went, unless someone at the King's Arms told you the gossip. Well, Janet wouldn't stay because she thought something whispered to her in the cellars. Poor timid creature. It was all fancy, for if anything were to whisper, you know, it would whisper to me. Would you like to see the garden? Most of it has gone back, of course. They poked about in the overgrown walks of the policies, talking of trifles, and presently strayed near the chapel ruin. May I glance inside? Asked Bain. There's very little, she answered somewhat sharply, but Bain had already passed through the broken doorways. Some defaced 16th and 17th century monuments were fixed to the walls, and a litter of leaves encumbered the pavement. Where his feet scattered these, Bain noticed 2 or 3 ancient bronze rings fixed in stone slabs, and being rather vain of his strength of arm, he bent, gripped one of them, and pulled upwards. The stone lifted very slightly, though it was heavy, and when Bain let go the ring, the slabs settled back with a dull reverberation. "Oh, for God's sake, stop!" He swung around to her. That delicate pallor of her young face had gone grey. She clutched at the door molding for support. Bain took her hands in his to save her from falling, and led her toward the house. "What is it, Mrs. Lurlin?" He felt a mingled alarm and pleasure thus to have a bond between them, even the terror in her eyes. "You shouldn't have done that. He's under, just under." Of course, in his wool-gathering, Bain had nearly forgotten this girl had ever had a husband. He muttered something awkward in his contrition. "I thought, with the leaves about and everything so neglected, you know, I thought no one would have been laid there this century." She was calmer now, and they re-entered the house through the kitchen door. "I know. They shouldn't have put anyone there. After all this time. His uncle and grandfather are in the kirkyard in the village, and his 2 cousins. But he had to have himself buried in the old crypt. He wrote it into his will. Do you understand why? Because he knew I'd loathe it. I think tea will be ready, Captain Bain." At the tea table, in a pleasant corner room of one tower, she was cool and even witty. Bain saw in her a girl become woman in short space, a year or 2 perhaps. She was charming and possibly wise, but something stirred woefully, now and again, beneath this pretty surface. The afternoon went rapidly and smoothly. When it was time for Bain to leave, she went with him to the great door, and she said, deliberately, "Come to tea tomorrow, too, if you like." Startled, Bain hesitated. She caught him up, with just a hint of flash in her eyes, before he had said anything. "But don't trouble, Captain Bain, if you're too busy." "I'm never busy, Mrs. Lurlin," he told her, unable to repress his old arrogant grin. "Shall I be frank? I was surprised that you should ask me. I'm thoroughly déclassé." She looked at him steadily. "I believe you're decent. I have no friends, and I hate to be solitary here, day on day. I'm afraid to be alone." "I wouldn't take you to be timid, Mrs. Lurlin." "Don't you understand? I thought you'd guessed." She came a trifle closer to Bain, and she said, in her low, sweet voice, "I'm afraid of my husband." Bain stared at her. "Your husband? I understood. I thought that he's dead." "Quite," said Anne Lurlin. Somewhere in that Minoan maze of a house, a board or table creaked. The wind rattled a sash, and this little room at the stair-foot was musty. "You knew, don't you?" Mrs. Lurlen whispered. "You knew something's near." Bain stayed on at the King's Arms, and every afternoon he walked up the barren lawn to Sorworth Place for tea. Some days he came early, and with Mrs. Lurlen he tramped over the muir of Sorworth, talking of books and queer corners and the small things of nature. Anne Lurlen, he perceived, was one of those women, now unhappily rare, who delight in knowing about squirrels' habits and in watching field mice and peeking into birds' nests with a childlike curiosity quite insatiable. On one afternoon they reached the summit of the law and looked back upon the place. A vast, twisted oak, still bare of new leaves, stood halfway between them and the house, its black branches outlined like fingers against the grey of the distant mansion. This was the finest of many brave views on the muir of Sorworth, and they could see the colliery, a distant smudge far down in the valley, and the red roofs of Sorworth village, at this remove still seeming the douce market town that it had once been. In the several days that had elapsed since Bain's first call, Mrs. Lurlen had not touched upon the theme of her parting shot at the stair-foot, and Bain had been content to let that field lie fallow. But now she clutched his arm, and he sensed that the mood was upon her again. She was looking intently toward a rise of ground this side of the oak. "Do you?" She checked herself, and said instead, "Do I seem rational to you, Captain?" She did, he told her, but he said nothing at all of the rest he felt about her. "I am going to put your confidence to the test." He observed that her charming lips were pressed tightly together, when for a moment she was silent. "Do you think you see anything between us and that tree?" Bain studied the face of the moor. At first he detected nothing. Then, for just an instant, it seemed as if some large, stooping creature had hurried from one hillock to another, perhaps its back showing above the bracken. "I don't know, Mrs. Lurlen," he said, a bit too quickly. "A dog?" "It didn't seem like a dog to you, now did it?" She looked into his eyes, and then turned her sleek head back toward the moor. "No, I suppose it's a man out ferreting?" But he let his inflection rise towards the end of the sentence. "No one keeps ferrets here, Captain Bain. I'm glad you saw it too, because I feel less mad. But I don't think anyone else would have made it out. You saw it because you know me so well, and because of that crack in your poor head, perhaps. I fancy it makes you sensitive to certain things." Bain thought it the kindest to be blunt. He asked her what way she was rowing. "Let's sit down here on the heather, then," she went on, "where we can see for a good way round. I'd rather not talk about this when we're in the house. First, I thought to say something about my husband." Perceiving that all this hurt her, Bain murmured that he had been told her late husband had been no credit to the family. "No," said Anne Lurlen, "no. Have you read Trollope, Captain? Perhaps you remember how he describes Sir Florian in the Eustace Diamonds. Sir Florian Eustace had only 2 flaws. He was vicious, and he was dying. Now Lizzie Eustace married Florian knowing these things, but I didn't know them about my husband when I married. I hadn't any money, and no relative left worth naming. Alistair, though he looked sick even then, had manners. I don't suppose I wanted to look very closely. Afterward, I found he was foul." Bain dug his fingers into the heather. "If we were to walk down toward that tree," said Mrs. Lurlen, after a silence, I don't think we'd meet anything, not yet. I don't believe there's any body to what we saw. I fancy it was only a kind of presentiment. I've been alone here more than once and caught a glimpse of something and made myself hunt, but nothing ever was there. Supposing a thing like that could rise, Bain interjected, stealthily surveying the bracken. Why should he have power over you? You're not foul. She did not seem to hear him. He wanted everything to be vile, and me to be vilest of all. Sometimes I think it was the pain of dying in him that made him try to befoul everything. When he found he couldn't break me, he cursed like a devil, really as if he were in hell. But I stayed with him to his last day. I was his wife, whatever he was. Most of the time he lay with his eyes shut, only gasping. But in the evening, when he was nearly gone, I could see he was trying to speak, and I bent down, and he smirked and whispered to me, You think you're won free, Anne? No, wait a year. I'll want you then. A year? Asked Bain. It will be a year, next Friday. Now I'm going to confess something. She turned her little body so that her eyes looked directly into Bain's. When I saw you in the square, I wondered if I could use you. I had some notion that I might stick a life between myself and... You looked no better than a daredevil. Do you mind my saying that? Something in me whispered, He was made to take chances. That's what he's good for. I meant you to come and see me. I don't suppose it flatters you, Ralph, to have been snared by a mad woman. No, Bain answered her. You're not mad. We both may be dolls in someone's dream, Anne, but you're not mad. And you'd best go for good, she told him. I don't want to stain you with this, now that you know. I want you to go away. You can't dismiss me. Bain contrived to grin his old grin. I'm not in your net. But how am I to get into your mind, Anne? How am I to stand between you and what your memory calls up? If only it were memory and fancy, I could bear it. She shut her eyes. A glimpse of him in a dream, a trick of imagination where it turned a dark corner, a shape dodging on the moor, those might pass away. But I think he's coming. Now you'll know I'm fit for bedlam. I think he's coming, well, in the flesh, or something like. Nonsense, said Bain. Very well then, I'm mad, but you'll bear with me, Ralph. Perhaps something in me calls him. Possibly I even control him after a fashion. But I think he'll be here Friday night. Believing she might faint, Bain put his big hand behind her head. If you really think that, Anne, leave the house, and we'll go to Edinburgh, or London, or where you like. We'll leave now. Where could I live? She nodded toward the grey castle. It's all I have. Not even enough to pay my rent. Anywhere else. And then, it would make no difference. I think he'd follow me. He wants life to drag down with him. Either he must break me, or he must be broken somehow himself, before he'll rest. Bain sat a while, and presently said, Do you want me to watch at Sorworth Place on Friday night, Anne? She turned her head away, as if ashamed of her selfishness. I do. It passed through his mind that she might think he was making a rake's bargain with her over this wild business. A bargain he might have made with another woman, or even with this one at another time, he admitted to himself, but not with a woman beside herself with terror. "You understand, Anne," he blurted, "that I'm asking nothing of you. Not now." "I knew," she whispered, her face still averted. "I'm offering nothing, but your death of fright." And then she tried to laugh. "Who'd think, to look at you, Captain Bain, that you're so very proper? I'd rather be scandalous than damned." Thus it was settled, and though the two walked and talked and drank their tea on the Tuesday and the Wednesday and the Thursday, they did not mention again her past or her future. Whatever sighed in some passage or cupboard of that old house, whatever shifted and faded across the moor, why, such intimations they ignored, speaking instead of the whops that cried from the sky above them, or of stories they had loved as children. Old Sorworth Place still was fit to stand a siege, Bain told himself as he mounted the staircase between the turrets on the Friday afternoon. The lower windows could not be forced. The doors were immensely stout. Anything that had substance might scrape and pound in vain outside all night, once the bolts were shot home. Anne Llewellyn herself admitted him, and they went to sit in her little study, and the hours fled, and their tea, untasted, grew cold, and at length they heard fat Margaret shuffle down the kitchen passage, open the door, and make her way through the policies toward the distant sanctuary of her son's cottage. Then Anne's eyes seconded Bain's glance, and he ran down the stair to the kitchen door, locked it, and made sure the great door was as well bolted. He returned to the study, and the pale girl with the great black eyes. The night was coming on. They could think of very little to say. Here was Bain locked in for the night with the woman he most desired, though he had known many women too well. Yet Tantalus be his delight. Unless she sought him, he would not touch her, in this her hour of dismay. "Where will you stay?" asked Bain, when the sun had sunk quite below the level of the little west window of the study. "In my bedroom," she said drearily enough. "There's no place safer." Her room was in the southern tower. Bain's mind reviewed the plan of the place. "Is there a way into the tower, except through the great hall?" She shook her sweet head. "There were doors from the other levels once, but they were blocked up long ago." This made his work easier. "Well then, Anne, your bogle will have to swallow me whole before he opens the door behind the hanging, and I'm a sour morsel." He didn't admit the possibility of fleshly revenants, Bain told himself, and if he could keep her safe from frenzy this one night, she might be safe forever after. Solemn as a hanging judge, she looked at him for what seemed a long time. "You shouldn't stay here, Ralph. I shouldn't have let you." She ran her little tongue along her dry lips. "You know I can never be anything to you." This was said with a kind of frozen tenderness. These words hurt him beyond belief, yet he had expected them. He saw himself as if in a mirror, his shallow, tired, defiant face, his frayed clothes, every long, lazy inch of himself, futile and fickle. "No," said Bain, managing a hoarse laugh. "No, Anne, of course you can't. Not tonight. I meant to sit outside your door." Biting her lip, she murmured, "Not tonight, nor any other night, ever." "Well," Bain said, "you needn't drive the point home with a hammer. Besides, you might care for me in better days." She continued to look at him as if beseeching mercy. "You don't understand me, Ralph. It's not you. Why, so far as I still can care for any man, I care for you. Anyway, I'm grateful to you as I've never been to anyone else. I'd give myself to you if I could. It's not what you think. It's this. After having a year with him, I couldn't bear to be anything to a man again. It would be dreadful. I can't forget." "Don't tell yourself that." Bain spoke slowly and heavily. "It won't be true. Given time, this night and your life with that fellow will wash away. But I suppose I'll be gone, and good riddance." She lit a candle. Paraffin lamps and candles were the only lighting in the place. Now, he knew, their night of listening and guarding must commence. "You can still go, Ralph," she told him softly. "A moment ago, I hinted that I felt something for you, but that was because I tried to be kind. Kind, well, whatever makes you do this for me. In honesty, I don't love you, though I should." "Bravado," Bain said, "and boredom mixed." He was glad that she could not see his eyes or his mouth in that feeble candlelight. "Now up with you. Let me play my game of hide-and-seek, Anne Llewellyn." He went with her to the door behind the hanging and watched her ascend to the first turn of the stair. Looking back upon him, she contrived with a smile of understanding, and was gone to her room. Alone, he felt a swelling of confidence. "Come on, if you like, Alistair Llewellyn, Esquire," he thought. "I'm your man for a bout of creep-mouse." Before settling himself in the hall for the night, he must make sure that no one was playing tricks, a remote possibility that he had kept in the back of his mind by way of a forlorn link with the world of solid things. So, taking his little electric torch from his pocket, he proceeded to inspect every chill corner of the place, apart from Anne's south tower, with a military thoroughness. Certain corners of this pile were calculated to make one wary, but they were empty, every one. After half an hour or so, he found himself looking from a loophole in the north tower. Across the main block of the house, he saw a light glowing in Anne's window. There she would be lying in a passion of dread, but nothing should force itself upon her this night. Returning to the main block, he listened. Nothing. For a parson's son, he thought, Ralph Bain gets in peculiar nooks. Then he opened a door into the great hall. Oh God! Something white was in the stair door, even then slipping out of the hole into the turret. He flung himself across the hall, down the stair, and leaped the last twist of the spiral to overtake the white fugitive. It was Anne Llewellyn, pressing herself against the great door. She shuddered there in her nightgown, her slim naked feet upon the damp flagstones. For a tremendous instant he thought his own desperate longing might have stirred some impulse in her, that she might have come to see him out of love or gratitude. But a glance at her face undid his hope. She was nearly out of her mind, a tormented thing fumbling at the oak, and when he took her by the arms, she panted spasmodically and managed to say, "I don't know why I'm here. I wanted to run out, run and run." For only a moment he pressed her body to his. Then, picking her up, he carried her to the door behind the hanging and thrust her in. "Go back, Anne, I've promised you." She put both her chill hands in his, looked at him as if she were to paint his picture, and kissed him lightly with cold lips. Then she crept up the steps. He bolted the little tapestried door from his side. Well, back to sentry duty. What hadn't he inspected in the house? The cellars. Down you go, Captain Bain. They were fine old Scots vaults of flinty stone, those cellars, but he detested them this night. Outside, a light rain was falling. He sat upon a broken stool in the cellar that had been a medieval kitchen, shadowed by a protruding oven. This was the ragtaggle end of chivalry, all right. A worn-out fool crouching in a crumbling house to humor a crazy girl. Then something crunched on the gravel outside the barred window. From old soldierly habit, Bain kept stock still in the shadow. He saw it plain, so that there could be no possibility of illusion, and he asked himself, in a frantic sensation of which he was at once ashamed, "What have you got yourself into, Ralph Bain, for the sake of a pretty little thing that won't be yours?" It was a face at the slit of the window, damn it, a sickening face. The nose snubbed against the glass, like a little boy's at a sweet shop. The eyelids of this face were drawn down, but while Bain watched, they slowly opened, as if drawn upward by a power beyond themselves, and the face turned awkwardly upon its neck, surveying the cellar. Somehow Bain knew, with an immense temporary relief, that he was not perceived in his sanctuary back of the oven, supposing the thing could perceive in any ordinary sense. Then the face withdrew from the window, and again Bain heard the gravel crunch. Some little time elapsed before Bain could make his muscles obey him. The crunching grew fainter, and then, hearing with a preternatural acuity, he made out a fumbling at the small kitchen door down the passage, but it was a vain fumbling. Something groped, lifted the latch, pressed its weight against the barrier. The stout door did not budge. At this, Bain experienced a reckless exultation. Whatever was outside in the night obeyed in some sort the laws of matter. "Go on, you deadheads," thought Bain wildly. "Fumble, damn you! Push! Scratch like a cat! You'll not get at her!" Rising from his stool, Bain tiptoed down the passage, and heard the stumbling feet in the gravel, moving on. Would it try the big doors? Of course. Let it try. Bain told himself that he had to look at what was outside, and he made his way to the lowest loophole of the left-hand turret, which commanded the steps. There was moon enough to show him the stairs. They were empty, but the great door, a trifle ajar, was just closing behind whatever had entered. He sucked in his breath, and believed he would go mad. Oh Lord, it's in, and I'm done for!" These phrases thrust through his consciousness like hot needles, yet a dogged rationality contended against them. However had that door been forced? Then he thought of Anne in her nightgown. Before he had caught her, she must have drawn the bolt, and he, in his lovesick anxiety, had forgotten to try it. Collusion between the living and the damned. This conjecture of treachery woke in him, and he felt momentarily that all his days with Anne Llewellyn had been part of a witch's snare, but he rejected that doubt. Whatever had moved Anne, whether simple terror and a foolish hope of flight, or some blind impulse forced upon her out of the abyss, no deceit lay in her. These sterile reflections occupied no measurable time. Face it out, Bain. Nothing else for it. With luck, he could be in the hall first. He was up the kitchen stair and through the anteroom as fast as ever he had moved in his life. An uncertain moonlight showed him the hall. He was alone in it, barring the way to the tapestried door. But then the door from the turret stair opened. Something entered. Just inside the hall, the thing paused heavily. Light enough came from the great window to outline it. Bane had not the heart to pull out his torch. Indeed, he could not move at all. Again he looked upon the sagging face he had seen in the cellar loop. The thing was clothed in a black suit, all mildewed. Its slow body seemed to gather itself for new movement. Who would be master? Who would move first? These points might decide the issue, Bane hoped. Perhaps a horrid logic governed this contest. Ralph Bane then compelled himself to take 2 steps forward toward the middle of the hall. He looked at the dark shape by the window, and twice tried to speak, and on the 3rd attempt a few broken words croaked from his throat. "Time you were properly buried, old man." No answering sound came. Bane flexed his arms, but could not force himself to advance further. He could discern no expression upon the face, only a blackened mask obedient to some obscene impulse from a remote beyond. How long they two stood there, Bane did not know, but presently the thing swung about awkwardly, lurched over the threshold, and was gone back into the darkness of the stair turret. Bane thanked God with all sincerity. Now who was the hunter, and who the quarry? The will was in him to make an end of this thing. Would it have gone back to the door and out into the rain? Bane listened. Yes, there came a stumbling from the stair. From above. What was it trying for? And then Bane knew. Ah, what a fool he was. It was ascending to the roofs, and would cross the slabs to the woman whose passionate terror perhaps animated its shape. Bane went after it, slipping and bruising himself in his urgency, but as he leapt up the spiral towards the higher stories of the north tower, he felt a cold draught sweeping down upon him. The thing had got open a window, and must be upon the roof. Bane found that window, and stared into the night. Now the rain fell heavily, and down at the foot of the wall, Sorworth water moaned and gleamed. From Anne Lauren's room, the candlelight cast some faint radiance upon the stone slabs of the sharp-peaked roof, and the glimmer was enough to show Bane a sodden bulk inching its way along the gutter toward the south tower, a footing precarious enough in daylight. The ruined face was averted from Bane, whatever power moved the thing being intent upon that piteous lighted window. What propelled Ralph Bane then was an impulse beyond duty, beyond courage, beyond even the love of a woman. He dropped from the window upon the wet and shimmering slabs, clambered along the gutter, and flung himself upon the dark hulk. Bane heaved with all the strength that was in him. Together, living and dead, they rolled upon the mossy old stones. Together, they fell. A glimpse of the great stone wall, a flash of the savage burn, then explosion of everything, opening to a blessed dark. Early on Saturday morning, a lone fisherman out of Sorworth, rowing near the reefs that lie off the mouth of Sorworth water, thought he perceived some unpleasant mass lying nearly submerged in a tangle of kelp along the rocks. But the sea boils nastily there, and the fisher folk of Sorworth are of the old legend-cherishing sort, and this man recalled certain things muttered by the arthritic old hag in the chimney-corner, his mother. Rather than rowing closer in, then, he worked his boat round and made back towards the decayed little harbor. Some hours later, having got 2 friends into the boat for company, he returned to the skurries for the closer look. But the tide had ebbed, and if anything human or human-like had been lodged earlier among the rocks, now it was gone forever. Whatever ends in the boiling sea upon the reefs, having tumbled down the den of Sorworth water, never wakes again.